You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 77, covering the week of June 19th through June 23rd, 2017. Glad to have you back on the program. Glad to be here. Before we get started, just want to do our regular housekeeping material. If you like this podcast, please share it around on social media. Also, you can follow us on social media. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and like our YouTube account. Simply go out and do a search for Abbeville Institute on those social media platforms. We have an ever-growing social media presence, so we do want your participation. Also, remember that the Abbeville Institute exists on your generous contributions alone, so please consider a tax-deductible contribution to the Institute. It will help us keep the lights on, help us keep this podcast, our website running, and all of our programs going as well. We do have a program coming up July 9th through 14th, our 2017 summer school, the 15th annual summer school at Seabrook Island, South Carolina. It's going to be a grand time, it always is. And you'll hear a number of great talks, including one by yours, actually two by yours truly. So going out there, we still have a few slots available. If you are a college student, a graduate student or undergraduate student, or an advanced high school student, we do have scholarships available. Just contact Dr. Livingston. All of that information is available on our website. If you go to our website, www.abbevilleinstitute.org, you can give us an email address and we'll send you a daily email, our Daily Dose of Dixie, and also a weekly email, our Week in Review, which runs every Sunday. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. Plus, if you give us that email address, we'll give you a free ebook, Kirkpatrick Sale's Emancipation Hell. So please consider going out there and doing all of those things. We do appreciate your support. Now, let's talk about the week that was at the Abbeville Institute. A lot of good stuff this week, a lot of material that is appropriate for the current controversies that we have going on in our political climate, and a number of these were actually written years ago. And the thing that I like about these pieces, it goes to show that this particular attack is not new. In fact, it's been going on now for decades, really since the 1980s. And when you go back and you read, for example, old Southern partisan magazines, you'll find that the assault on Confederate symbols, on the South, Southern history, the Southern tradition, has been ongoing for a very long time. And I think it's sad that we've gotten to a point where people are actually winning. It used to be that our side was able to push these back. You still have people that were wise enough and logical enough not to capitulate to the demands to remove Confederate symbols or, things that people considered offensive. And unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. So a number of the pieces this week were written in the 1990s, and they reflect that even then. Of course, 1994, there was a concerted effort to get rid of the offensive, quote-unquote, offensive UDC symbol. We've had the attack on the Confederate flag since the 1990s. Of course, when I was in South Carolina going to graduate school, that was when the major assault began on the Confederate flag over the Capitol there. And, of course, it came down and then was moved to a soldier's monument out front. And then, of course, that's now been removed. And everyone knew it was just a slippery slope. It was the first step. And now, as we've seen, not only are Confederate statues under attack, but Andrew Jackson is under attack in New Orleans. You have people that are trying to change the name of James Madison High School in Wisconsin because Madison was a slave owner. And you're going to see this now all over the United States. It's not just going to be Confederate symbols. It's going to be other members of the founding generation who were considered to be less than savory because of their involvement in slavery. Now, I just had a supporting member of the Institute send me an email the other day with a plaque that's been erected at Brown University explaining that Brown was complicit in the slave trade. Moses Brown, who the university is named after, was complicit in the slave trade. In fact, made all of his money on the slave trade. So they've contextualized the university, yet I don't see anyone calling for the Board of Regents at Brown University to change the name of the university to something more politically correct. It's just sufficient there to put a plaque out showing guilt that in the 18th century or the 17th century, Rhode Islanders were involved in the slave trade. That's sufficient now. You can't get away. You can't change the name of Brown because that just wouldn't work. But of course, I don't know, but I think there is a statue of Moses Brown at Brown University. So, or things that are related to Moses Brown. So we're not going to take those statues down or anything like that. We're just going to put a plaque up and contextualize it. And so this is the hypocrisy of the entire thing. Whereas Moses Brown was making tremendous amounts of money. It's just sufficient to say, well, the guy made money on slavery, and we're sorry for that. But we're just going to leave everything else alone. But then you have someone like Robert E. Lee, who, by all accounts, was a much more moderate member of the South when it came to the issue of slavery, and of course was considered to be an American hero for much of American history following the war. When you have someone like Lee, well, you have to take his statue down because he was associated with the South. And of course, everyone at the time, even at the time the Constitution was written, for example, George Mason of Virginia condemned the North and Southerners as well, particularly from South Carolina, for wanting to keep alive the slave trade, which he considered to be the worst part of the institution. This is the interesting part of the debate over slavery, the hypocrisy and the double standard that we get. And I'm going to talk about, there's one piece that we ran on Friday that has a wonderful quote in it that I think is something that anyone who's writing Southern history today should think about when they start talking about the institution of slavery. So first we'll start with a piece by Ryan Walters on Monday. Why does the left really despise the Confederacy? And he asked the question. The big question is why this is happening. Why are leftist Democrats taking aim at the South? Why the Soviet-style erasing of history? And he says there was a recent explanation from Joseph Farah at WorldNet Daily. And this is a quote from Farah. I have a theory. I don't think it explains the phenomenon in its entirety, but I definitely think it's part of the explanation for the scorched earth policy against American history, the attempt to erase any historical vestige of the most costly war in our history. First, you'll notice that Democrats are nearly always at the forefront of this kind of activity. Why would this be? Could it be because they are embarrassed and ashamed of their party's own history? So, Walters goes on to say, quote, there is certainly some merit to Farah's theory, but it has a few flaws, not the least of which is his persistent quoting of Eric Foner, who is in fact so much of a radical communist that students at Columbia University, of all places, call him Eric the Red. He says the current leftist attack, though, is not on American history, but Southern, and not on the totality of the war, just on anyone who fought on the Southern side of it. So he brings up the fact that there's this misguided application of, Republican good, Democrat bad. And this is problematic in our understanding of American history. There was actually a little video that Prager University, which has produced a very stupid video on the war, but they produced another stupid video about the Democratic Party. And this is commonplace among Republican partisans to go out and show the Democrats, supported secession, the Democrats supported slavery, the Democrats supported segregation, all these other things. And this is the history of the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party, of course, never supported any of those things, which simply isn't true. There's so many mistakes in that. I mean, the Republican Party did support segregation. They were the masterminds of it. When you look at Republican rhetoric before the war, they were all for separation of the races and, of course, the colonization of black Americans. So it's a stupid position to take. I mean, that's the only way to put it. It's ahistorical. And so Ryan gets into a little history of the South, and he says the Jeffersonian South represented, and has always represented, decentralization, states' rights, and federalism, and an economic program not centered on favoritism and plunder. From Jefferson's election in 1800, over the ensuing 6 decades, the nation was governed, for the most part, by Jeffersonian values, seen by most Americans as the ideological carrier of the Revolution. Which is true. I mean, Jeffersonian America won out over Hamiltonian America from about 1801 until 1861. There were, of course, periods where it wasn't ascendant, but for the most part, Jeffersonianism won. And, of course, so Walter says, but by 1860 to 61, the more Hamiltonian-minded North, with a federal government led by Lincoln, was headed the other way and sought a transformation of the country into a national union. Lincoln wanted to impose upon the entire country the vision first espoused by Hamilton and later by Clay, a system of high protective tariffs, federal programs for internal improvements, and a national bank. Policies that would have plundered and bankrupted the South, along with a government in Washington that had no respect for the rights of the states or the Constitution as originally written. And so what he's saying here is that you had this battle of principles in 1860 and 61 that was deeper than just this surface issue of slavery. Certainly, slavery was an important issue. Certainly, slavery as a political issue was very powerful, but this is why you have to ask the question, why slavery? Why was slavery such a powerful issue? Was it because you had altruistic Northerners who were insistent on ending the institution because they considered it to be inhumane, because they worried about the plight of black Southerners? No. Most Northerners worried about the institution of slavery because it gave the South political power in their mind. Undeserved political power. When you look at the Three-Fifths Compromise of the Constitution, this is why during the War of 1812, the Hartford Convention, New England sought to have a constitutional amendment which removed the Three-Fifths Compromise from the Constitution because they thought the South had unwarranted political power. And, of course, when you look at the issue of the extension of slavery, the battle over that, what was really at stake there, more than anything else, was adding more southern states and essentially more votes to the Senate. Because more votes to the Senate for the South meant that they could block the Northern economic program. And so the North realized very early on, in 1819, essentially, right after the war, that if they could make the slavery issue important, they could peel away the West, particularly the Midwest, from the Southern sphere of influence. Calhoun recognized this. He said, look, we need to start thinking about what the West wants, or they're going to start voting with the North, and we're going to lose our political clout. This is why in 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase was made, Northerners screamed bloody murder. This is why the Essex Junto wanted to get out of the Union at that point, because they thought all these farmers would come into the Union, and all that would do would be to give the South more votes, because they were farmers, and farmers stick together, and farmers don't want protective tariffs and central banking and internal improvements and all the things the industrializing and commercial North wanted. Now, the North was not really that much industrialized in 1803, but they were much more commercial. This is why George Mason wanted to have a constitutional amendment that would limit the power of the commercial North. I mean, it's all there to see. This debate began long before the slavery issue was interjected into federal politics in the middle of the 19th century. It's all there. All you have to do is go back and read the history. So it's important to point out that all of these things that are now major issues. Well, I mean, this is what the South always wanted. It was always about slavery. Well, no, it was always about Jeffersonian political economy and political power. Walters concludes the piece by saying, so the truth should be plain to see. The Confederacy, symbolized by the Confederate battle flag, represents the greatest act of resistance to centralized authority in U.S. history. That's why they hate it, and that's why it must go, lest we get any bright ideas about trying it again. American citizens must remain subject to the state, and no inspirational symbols of rebellion can be tolerated. Which is true. I mean, this was pointed out in Time magazine. There was an article about the Maryland state song, Maryland, My Maryland, and the author of the piece said that this song is dissident. This is why we can't have it It's dissident. I mean, it shows that Southerners are giving the United States government the big middle finger. And so that's why people don't want to tolerate that particular flag. It's dissident. It's something that most Americans see as an act of disloyalty. So we don't want to have that running around. On Tuesday, we ran a piece, a book review, written by Benjamin Alexander. Benjamin Alexander now teaches at Franciscan University of Steubenville. He actually studied under Andrew Nelson Lytle and Mel Bradford. This piece was published in the 1980s. But it's a review of a book entitled The Southern Vision of Andrew Lytle. It's written by a guy named Mark Lucas, and it was published by LSU Press in 1987. More than anything, what Dr. Alexander does is get into who Andrew Lytle really was. And if you don't know who Andrew Lytle was, of course, he was one of the important authors of the book I'll Take My Stand. And he actually, what Alexander says is we can take heart that Lytle himself has never retreated from the political and social positions he promoted in his agrarian years. Among numerous recent public pronouncements, Lytle contributed the afterword to a group of essays commemorating the 50th anniversary of I'll Take My Stand. This is a book edited by the Abbeville Institute's own Clyde Wilson. It came out in 1981, entitled Why the South Will Survive. And Lytle notes that I'll Take My Stand has never been out of print, that the book is a contemporaneous, not a historical document. And this is true. I remember taking a seminar on the New South at South Carolina, and the book I'll Take My Stand was actually assigned, and there was this hippie fellow in the class, and he loved it because it was an agrarian manifesto. And that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize. That this modern environmentalist movement, which has taken on a different type of tone, it's much more communist oriented and much more interested in worshiping Mother Earth. It's not as Christian influenced, but the agrarians were definitely Christian influenced. However, it has its roots in the South. It has its roots in the Jeffersonian agrarianism. There is actually people in this modern environmentalist movement love Wendell Berry, and Wendell Berry is certainly Southern more than anything else. And so I think that that's something that we should always be talking about. The respect for the environment, agrarianism, self-reliance, independence, all of these things are really born out of the Southern Jeffersonian tradition. We've run many essays on that in our time, in the last 3 years that we've upgraded the website and been much more active in our material. So I think it's important to note that, and this is why you should know who Lytle was. And so, when we talk about agrarianism, and we talk about people like Lytle, what we're really looking at here is a way of life. And so this book by Lucas is critical of Lytle's fiction. But as Alexander points out, it's also unjustly critical of I'll Take My Stand. And Alexander says this, quote, "The agrarians have achieved enduring notoriety in the half-century since their writings precisely because whatever applied economic and social principles they espoused emanated from a political order whose roots lie in the societies of antiquity. Lytle is a provocative man of letters in the tradition of Dr. Johnson, Edmund Burke, T.S. Eliot, Russell Kirk, and more recently, Alan Bloom. His political loyalties are of a piece with later aesthetic principles of artistic accomplishments that comprise an organic whole. The health of what the ancients understood as the polis, the political community, is of vital importance to the exercise of citizenship, and the cultivation of Aristotelian citizen virtues runs parallel to the practice of literary craftsmanship." Alexander says such a legacy is not dated, but is the enduring inheritance of the West. That's so important, to attach the Southern tradition with antiquity, with Western civilization. Even H.L. Mencken, in his very famous or infamous The Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, pointed out that his problem with the New South was that it didn't match the Old South, which he said was the most beautiful civilization in American history. So when you look at what Lytle represented, he represented this continuity between the old and the new, between old Western civilization and modern American society. And I think that's something that we're losing as we attack the Southern tradition. Because all traditions have good and bad. You can take what's good, you can take what's bad. You can emulate the good. This is what Livy said years ago when he wrote, "History is the best medicine for a sick mind." You can emulate the good and distance yourself from the bad. And there's so much good in Southern history and Southern culture and Southern society that should be emulated, that attacking it is ruining it all. And so I think that's something we have to remember. On Wednesday, we published a piece by James Ronald Kennedy entitled "The Ad Too Hot to Print, Progressive Censorship in Action." So this was an ad that they tried to run in a Louisiana newspaper, and it was rejected. And when you read it, you wonder why. It's very even-handed. And it's very conciliatory. It's reconciliation. He points out, the Kennedys point out, the art of memory allows us to memorialize individuals for their virtues, things that we wish future generations to emulate. There are no perfect leaders of the Confederacy, the Civil Rights Movement, or any other group. There are no leaders in which some fault, error, or indiscretion cannot be found. This most human factor should not be used to prevent us from honoring former civil rights, Confederate, or other leaders, honoring them for their virtue. And the Kennedys point out all citizens of Louisiana should take pride in our heritage. Every time your child or grandchild hugs a teddy bear, you should think of a black Confederate veteran Holt Collier. Collier was the hunting guide for Teddy Roosevelt who captured the small bear that Teddy refused to shoot. Thus the teddy bear was born. They say, as we point out, in the South was right. There were thousands of black Confederates. After the United States Supreme Court, not the Confederate States Supreme Court, made the infamous Jim Crow laws the law of the land, it was white Confederate veterans who defied both the law and local custom when they demanded and got the right to bury a black Confederate veteran in the local white-only cemetery. And the Kennedys say, and this is important, while it may be politically correct and profitable to slander black and white citizens who wish to honor their ancestors, it is not morally right. Such insults divide a people who should be united in their determination to judge people by the content of their character. That is the important part. It's profitable to slander black and white citizens. There's money involved in it. Money can be made. There can be political power made. You can garner votes nowadays, at least it's thought. This is why Landrieu wanted to do it in New Orleans, because he thought he was going to get some political clout when New Orleans is one of the least safest places in the world now. So maybe taking down a statue or two is going to make him feel better. It's not going to do anything, of course, for the plight of New Orleans. And so when you think about that, you get to the piece on Thursday, the real reason Confederate symbols are attacked. This was written by Tom Landis back in 1994. And it is spot on. This piece is over 20 years old now. Almost 23 years old. And he says some really important things. The same thing the Kennedys just said this week. He says, by the 1970s, all vestiges of legal discrimination in the South had been eliminated. Indeed, affirmative action programs, minority entitlements, and special considerations in the marketplace have given blacks a solid place at the table of mainstream American life. A new black middle class, driven by the work ethic and encouraged by private as well as public programs, is establishing itself in the American business community, South as well as North, South more than North. But he says, in the face of these changes, organizations like the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, add to that the Southern Poverty Law Center today, have found themselves writhing on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, just as ships acquire barnacles, they have, over a period of decades, acquired enormous staffs, professional activists whose livelihood depends on perpetual racial conflict. If these organizations declared victory, then their donor list would no longer have an incentive to send in contributions, and they would inevitably wither like raisins in the sun. So he says, well, not exactly in America. They found it as early as 1966 that while civil rights demonstrations in the South are sympathetically covered by the media and well-funded by the liberal establishment, the same tactics failed miserably in the North. He says Martin Luther King's crusade to desegregate the Chicago suburbs marked the end of the real civil rights movement in America. So the current black leadership remembers that lesson. They can't allege discrimination, so what they do is now they go after Confederate symbols. And so this provides them sympathetic media coverage. This provides them with ability to line their pockets. He says, Landis says, but the one thing that inspires a degree of hatred necessary to squeeze dollars from a dwindling donor list is the South passed. By almost all objective standards, this is Landis now, quoting, our region has much better race relations than any other, certainly better than the great northern urban centers we have always been urged to emulate. This is, C. Van Woodward pointed this out in The Strange Career of Jim Crow, when he wrote that, Jim Crow was born in the North. It's not sufficient for Northerners to lecture Southerners on race relations because race relations in the North have been bad. And he points out that a black writer who made his first fearful trip to the South wrote the following lines in the Washington Post. I quote, I'm too young to remember going to Columbia as a child, so I grew up in Washington, knowing the South only from books, television, and movies. The pictures indelibly imprinted in my mind are of rabid rednecks, fragile belles, and servile blacks coexisting in a place taut with hostility and sudden, inexplicable violence. And then there was the reality of what I experienced day after day. Everywhere I went, people were far more open and congenial than in the North, even in the most casual interactions. And everywhere, in cities and small towns, I saw blacks and whites working together, walking down the street together, talking together. Oh my gosh. No way. That didn't happen in the South. That had to be in Boston. Oh, yeah, right. In Boston in the 1970s, where there were race riots when the busing came, and there was a very famous picture of a white Bostonian beating up a black guy with a U.S. flag. Yeah, that was in Boston. No, this is in places like Atlanta or other southern cities, or in this case, Columbia, South Carolina. Oh, no, that can't be. That would have to be somewhere in the North. No, that was in the South. And so Landis says, hence this recent turning to the past for evidence of Southern injustice. Slavery and segregation have always been blood-boiling issues, the kind to provoke Northern donors to unzip their purses. So why not revive ills long since corrected, hurts long since fixed? So what happens is the people that start pushing these issues realize that by going after them, they can get more donations. They can build a big metropolis in Montgomery, Alabama to the SPLC. They can squeeze donors for tearing down Confederate monuments. Let's raise more money to do this and raise it for us. And so Landis has a very interesting point. If the flag reminds these people of segregation, and he brings up a point in Georgia, there was a decision to tear down a train station, and a lot of people howled and protested they were going to tear down the white and colored sign. signs that they said reminded them of segregation, then why are we demanding the removal of the Confederate flag? Landis says, if that's the case, why aren't they demanding that flags be flown at every corner of every street in every southern city? Why not have Dixie played at every ball game, every public meeting, and at the opening of every school day? He says, because that would be too simple. When we want to forget, they want to remember. It will be that way until the angel Gabriel blows his horn at the crack of doom, or until the money stops flowing. That's the real issue. And he says, so what we should just pay them. Just pay them off. Let the stuff stay and just keep sending them money. Unfortunately, that doesn't work anymore. The money keeps flowing, but they keep whining. All of these organizations that have now made tremendous amounts of money on attacking the South. But here you have in 1994, the same thing. And so on Friday, we ran a wonderful piece, Is the Confederacy Obsolete? This was written by the late Ludwell Johnson. Of course, Tom Landis is also dead now, too. But this is written by the late Ludwell Johnson. And it was talking about the Museum of the Confederacy and how, I mean, of course, there are now attacks on that institution, efforts to contextualize, quote-unquote, the Museum of the Confederacy. A museum. Now, in this particular piece, and I'm running short on time, it's a wonderful piece, and of course Ludwell Johnson concludes that no, the Museum of the Confederacy is not obsolete. The Confederacy is not obsolete. It's a wonderful thing that we should all remember. And he has a great quote, and it was not by any Southern historian. It was by Henry Steele Commander, who was a Northerner, taught at Amherst College, no apologist for the South. Commander said this. In an essay he wrote, should the historian sit in judgment? And he wrote that when slavery comes up, too often, quote, we invoke almost instinctively the vocabulary of morality. And this is a quote from Commander. Yet, when we come to pronounce judgment on slavery, we are met at the very threshold with the most intransient consideration. Generation after generation of good, humane, Christian men and women not only accepted it, but considered it a blessing. Certainly, we cannot fall back on the simple explanation that all of these men and women were bad. It is absurd for us to pass moral judgment on slaveholders, absurd to indict a whole people or to banish a whole people to some historical purgatory where they can expiate their sins. As Lincoln said in his second inaugural, but let us judge, not that we be judged. The historian's task is not to judge, but to understand. This is sacrilegious today. This is what Eugene Genovese said in his great work, The Mind of the Master Class, what he said in The Slaveholder's Dilemma, what he said in several different lectures. The Southern tradition has much to offer. And so, why do we always sit in judgment of slaveholders? And so Ludwell Johnson says, a fearless look at the past, however distasteful some of it may be, is essential to the understanding that Commander held up as a historian's first responsibility, and is equally essential to the museum's modern policy of moving with the times. He says, this is, after all, the Museum of the Confederacy. To satisfy the denouncers of the nation, which it memorializes, it would probably have to become a sort of Southern equivalent of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., a museum to keep alive memories of Southern iniquity, with perhaps a subtitle added to the inscription over the door, the Museum of the Confederacy. We're sorry. Johnson concludes, better to bring in the bulldozers than to agree to such an Orwellian rewriting of the past. So this is the point. This is where we are. And unfortunately, where we're going. But this piece was also written in 1994. So people should think about this. You know, this job of the historian is not to judge, but to understand. What were Southerners thinking? Why did they support these things? Why did they do these things this way? Why was slavery important? Was it a morality play? No. Well, you need to understand what these people were thinking. Understand where they were, and not to apologize for every terrible decision from modern standpoint made it in the history of the world. That's not our job. We need to understand, not condemn. I'll see you next time on the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute.